Have you ever been in one of those arguments where you just feel completely stuck? Where both sides feel totally misunderstood and you're just talking past each other? Well, that is exactly what it's like to read the ancient Book of Malachi. It's less of a sermon and more like the transcript of a spiritual stalemate, a really intense argument between a deeply disappointed people and their God. So let's dive into this ancient fight and see what it's all about.
Okay, so to really get what's going on here, you have to understand the setting. We're talking about the Restoration period, sometime in the mid-400s BC. The Jewish exiles have been coming home from Babylon, which should be this amazing triumphant moment, but it wasn't. The homecoming just fell completely flat. Instead of the golden age they'd been promised, they found themselves right back under foreign rule, this time by the Persians.
You can just feel the disappointment hanging in the air. Yeah, they'd rebuilt their temple, which was a huge deal, the center of their entire world. But the glory, that powerful presence of God that prophets had talked about, it just never showed up. And this led to this deep, creeping skepticism, a kind of spiritual numbness.
And this wasn't just some abstract spiritual crisis, right? Their day-to-day lives were a mess. Their economy was tanking because of bad harvests and locust plagues. Politically, they were totally powerless. And on the inside, their whole society was starting to unravel. People were intermarrying with foreigners, abandoning their heritage, and the divorce rate was just through the roof. Think about it. Decades have gone by, and the older generation is literally dying off without ever seeing those huge promises from God come true.
This is what makes the Book of Malachi so incredibly unique. The whole thing is basically structured as a series of 6 arguments, or what scholars call disputations. It's this amazing pattern. God makes a statement, the people shoot back with a really cynical question, and then God lays out his response. We're about to walk through the 4 biggest of these disputes.
So the very first argument goes right for the jugular. It's the most basic, fundamental question of all. Because when you're suffering, what's the first thing you start to doubt? You start to doubt if you're even loved. And that's exactly where the people start.
God kicks things off with a simple foundational claim. This is the bedrock of their whole relationship. I have shown love to you. And their reply, wow, it is just dripping with sarcasm and pain. You can just hear them saying, how? Seriously? Have you looked around? Look at our poverty. Look at our enemies. Where exactly is the proof of this love you're talking about? It's a question just loaded with distrust.
God's answer here is so fascinating. He doesn't point to their current circumstances at all. Instead, he points way back into their history. He says, remember Jacob and Esau? The nations that came from both of them were judged for their sin, but Edom, Esau's descendants, were destined for total destruction. Jacob, who is Israel, on the other hand, was chosen for this special covenant and was promised restoration after the judgment. So the point God is making is huge. His love for them isn't about guaranteeing a comfortable life. It's about a specific, unbreakable covenant choice.
Okay, so you've got this deep-seated doubt. What happens next? Well, that doubt starts to poison everything, especially their worship. And God turns his attention directly to the priests, the religious leaders, for letting this happen.
God's accusation is so direct. He basically says, look, a son honors his father, right? A servant respects his master. If I'm your father, where is my honor? If I'm your master, where is my respect? He accuses the priests of treating his very name, his character, his reputation, like it's nothing.
And here's the proof. It's a perfect picture of their contempt. The law was crystal clear. You bring God your absolute best, an animal with no defects. But what were the priests offering? Stolen, blind, lame, sick animals, the leftovers. And God sarcastically says, hey, try giving that to your human governor and see how he likes it. It's just brutal. It shows they cared more about pleasing a politician than the God of the universe.
And this gets right to the heart of it. Worship had become a chore. It was boring, it was a burden, it was total spiritual burnout. They were just going through the motions, and their hearts were a million miles away.
The third dispute shows how this spiritual rot doesn't stay contained. It starts to spread like a cancer into the rest of society. Because when your covenant with God is broken, it's just a matter of time before all the covenants between people start to crumble too.
It's a total domino effect. Their unfaithfulness to God created this whole culture of betrayal. First, they started betraying each other in the community. And then that betrayal drilled all the way down into the most basic building block of their society, the family.
And Malachi gets super specific. He calls out the men who were divorcing their Jewish wives, the women they had grown old with, so they could marry pagan women from the surrounding nations. And this wasn't just a private family issue, it was seen as a betrayal of the entire community and its covenant with God.
And then God drops this absolutely devastating line. He doesn't just say he dislikes divorce. He says he hates it. And then he connects the act of treacherously breaking that marriage covenant to an act of violence. I mean, that is a powerful, shocking statement.
This brings us to the last big argument, and it's probably the one that sounds the most modern. It's that timeless question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do the wicked always seem to get ahead? They look at the world around them, and they accuse God of being completely unjust. And their conclusion is just bleak. They've basically decided there's no point in being righteous. It doesn't pay. In fact, being wicked seems to be the fast track to success. They're literally saying it's useless to serve God because the arrogant and the evil are the ones getting ahead, and God just doesn't seem to care. So after all this back and forth, all this accusation, where do we land? Well, the book doesn't end with another argument. It ends with a verdict. And it's a verdict that holds two things at once: a terrifying warning and a deep, unshakable hope.
First, the warning. God says a day of reckoning is coming, the day of the Lord. And for the arrogant, for the wicked, for everyone who thought they were getting away with it, that day is going to be like a furnace. They'll be burned up like worthless chaff. Justice isn't gone, it's just on a delay.
But then, in the very next breath, the tone flips completely. For the faithful few who held on, the ones who still respected God's name even through all their doubt, that same day is not a day of terror, it's a day of triumph. It's not about fire, it's about light. The promise is that the sun of vindication will rise with healing wings. It's this beautiful picture of dawn breaking after a long, dark night, a promise that their struggle wasn't for nothing, and that restoration is really coming.
So how is this stalemate actually going to get broken? God promises to step in. He's going to send a special messenger, a figure like the prophet Elijah, to come and prepare people's hearts before that final day. This person's job is to call everyone back, to heal the broken families. It's basically God acknowledging that the people can't fix this on their own. The stalemate is too deep. They need someone to pave the way for God himself to show up and finally set things right.
And that leaves us with the central question of the book, doesn't it? A question that still echoes today. When your faith feels pointless and God feels a million miles away, when you're just locked in a spiritual stalemate, what does it really take to break it?